In our last episode, The Murder of the Goddess, we stated that an Egyptian pharaoh who was deformed physically due to a genetic abnormality, and thus unable to have sexual relations with women, even one of the most beautiful women in history, created monotheism in order to banish female deities once and for all, and to prevent their adoration and worship by everyone, both by women and by men. In other words, monotheism was created in order to firmly establish male hegemony and to assert that women are not only inferior, not only do they bear the guilt for all the sin in the world, but that they are also unclean. To state it bluntly, monotheism is a cult of misogyny. Bringing ourselves to the present day and to the introductory topic of this episode, for many men, sex is an act of violence, an act to, quote, put women in their place, unquote. It has very little, if anything, to do with affection or caring or even with sensuality, or even with pleasure. I would go so far as to say that ejaculation, minus any other sensual or caring and loving components, is not pleasurable. It is only about release of tension. I wrote in one of my books that, quote, for women, orgasm is a triumph. For men, it is a defeat. A radical statement, to be sure, but one which contains some truth, at least a grain of it. Men treat women violently because they ultimately feel defeated by the sex act. And that is because they know nothing about either love or sensuality. The idea that all humans have both a masculine and a feminine side, regardless of their biological genders, goes back to Carl Jung, someone with whom I disagree on almost everything. The anima and the animus are described in Carl Jung's school of analytical psychology as part of his theory of the collective unconscious. Jung described the animus as the unconscious masculine side of a woman, and the anima as the unconscious feminine side of a man, each transcending the personal psyche. Jung's theory states that the animus and anima are the two primary anthropomorphic archetypes of the unconscious mind, as opposed to the theriomorphic and thus inferior function of the shadow archetypes. He believed that they are the abstract symbol sets that formulate the archetype of the self. In Jung's theory, the anima makes up the totality of the unconscious feminine psychological qualities that a man possesses, and the animus, the masculine ones possessed by a woman. As far as sexuality is concerned, Jung's book Liber Novus, only published in 2009, contains statements such as, quote, the world of the gods is made manifest in spirituality and in sexuality. The celestial ones appear in spirituality, the earthly in sexuality, unquote. Here he divorces spirituality from sexuality. By inference, he is stating that in a certain way sexuality cannot be spiritual, which, needless to say, goes contrary to the entire premise of this podcast series. In the same posthumously published book, he also writes, spirituality conceives and embraces. It is womanlike, and therefore we call it Mater Celestis, the celestial mother. Sexuality, on the other hand, engenders and creates. It is manlike, and therefore we call it Phallos. Needless to say, Phallos is the phallus, the penis. So Jung is saying that sexuality, which he opposes to spirituality, is not only manlike, but is the penis itself. To continue with Jung, the sexuality of man is more earthly, that of woman is more spiritual, the spirituality of man is more heavenly, it moves toward the greater. Huh? These ideas of Jung and the whole notion that men have a, quote, feminine side, unquote, and women have a, quote, masculine side, unquote, have always troubled me. I don't like the idea that women who are assertive, are seen as having a strong masculine side. By the same token, and equally bad or worse, is the idea that when a man shows caring or compassion or tenderness or even sensuality, or even a form of love that is not dominant and controlling, he is, quote, showing his feminine side, unquote. That it is the feminine side of his brain and of his being that is in charge at those times. Men are brought up being sexually threatened. Sexually threatened in the sense that they feel that if they do not assert their masculinity, they will be shunned or rejected or made to feel inferior. Or worse, that they will be typed as mama's boys or even possibly as queer. Now here we are using the word queer not in the umbrella sense that it is sometimes used today to cover other aspects of sexuality that are not exclusively heterosexual. We're using it almost in the sort of playground, childhood way that it is still used amongst those who really have very little concept of what any of these ideas mean. Anyway, on an individual level, this is the origin of much male misogyny, since an easy and convenient way to demonstrate how dominant and masculine you are is to act like women are inferior and to treat them badly. This is the origin of much male misogyny, since an easy, quote-unquote, and convenient way to demonstrate how dominant and masculine you are is to act like women are inferior and to treat them badly. If you are a boy growing up, in many cases you are looked down upon if you have female friends. As boys advance into their teens, social interactions with girls become more acceptable, but they are always circumscribed. If a teenage guy hangs out with a teenage girl, it is assumed that he wants to get into her pants, or at least into her bra. On the other side of the coin, girls are socialized by their peer group to see the most aggressive boys, the football player types whose masculinity is very narcissistic, as the most desirable. What I propose is a radical departure from this idea that each person has a masculine and a feminine side. Since this idea puts social and other pressures on men to act hyper-masculine, and on some, thankfully not as much as it used to be, women to act hyper-feminine, to be girly girls. The way I see it is that there are special and unique male, masculine varieties of caring, tenderness, compassion, sweetness, adoration, and sensuality, which men exhibit amongst themselves and with women. To care and to be tender as a man is not exactly the same as to care and be tender as a woman. And to love as a man is not exactly the same as to love as a woman. In this hypersexualized world and misogynized, if I may say that, society, men are ashamed to love. And women are likewise ashamed to love because love for women has so long been defined as something submissive. To love a man is by definition, or by implication, or even unconsciously, to submit to him. If love is submission to anything, whether you are male or female, it is submission to the mandate to be sensual, to be caring, and to be tender. It is submission to the feeling and belief that your partner's happiness is co-equal as a desideratum with yours, or higher. Let us go on to discuss the difference between male ejaculation and male orgasm. According to a study by Alwal, Breyer, and Liu, published in 2015 in the journal Fertility and Sterility, in men, quote, orgasm and ejaculation are two separate physiological processes that are sometimes difficult to distinguish. Orgasm is an intense, transient peak sensation of intense pleasure, creating an altered state of consciousness associated with reported physical changes. Antegrade ejaculation is a complex physiological process that is composed of two phases, emission and expulsion, and is influenced by intricate neurological and hormonal pathways. Despite the many published research projects dealing with the physiology of orgasm and ejaculation, much about this topic is still unknown. Orgasm is generally associated with ejaculation, although the two processes are physiologically different. Certain physiological features are associated with orgasm and not with mere simple ejaculation. Those features including hyperventilation up to 40 breaths per minute, tachycardia, and high blood pressure. In fact, faster heart rate was found to be an indicator of, quote, real male orgasm during intravaginal intercourse, differentiating it from, quote, fake, unquote, orgasm. Going back again to this research study, orgasm in men is also associated with powerful and highly pleasurable pelvic muscle contractions, especially ischio-cavernous and bulbocavernous, along with rector sphinctal contractions and facial grimacing. Continuing. There is also an associated release and elevation in oxytocin levels after orgasm. Now, oxytocin is strongly associated with empathy. It facilitates trust and attachment. Studies have shown that oxytocin is correlated with romantic attachment. Oxytocin affects social distance between adult males and females and may be responsible, at least in part, for romantic attraction and subsequent monogamous pair bonding. An oxytocin nasal spray caused men in a monogamous relationship, but not single men, to increase the distance between themselves and an attractive woman during a first encounter by 10 to 15 centimeters. The researchers suggested that oxytocin may help promote fidelity within monogamous relationships. So men who have real orgasms, and we are speaking here only of orgasms as defined and classified by this particular research. Obviously, there are many other characteristics and qualities, both psychological and spiritual, to male orgasms, which were not studyable by these scientific methods. But we go on. So men who have real orgasms, as opposed to mere ejaculations, and who are in monogamous relationships, are going to be less likely to cheat. I repeat, men who have real orgasms are going to be less likely to cheat. So for men, to achieve real orgasms is of paramount importance. A woman made the following comment on my episode, The Murder of the Goddess. I like the title, Murder of the Goddess. For sure, I feel every time a man cheats on a woman, it's a murder of a goddess. It's a beating. Now, I'm not railing against open relationships or even those couples that choose mutually between them to be in the lifestyle. However, most women who believe that they are in exclusive relationships are brutalized emotionally when their men cheat. A woman believes that the man she's in a relationship with sees her as a goddess, and that is a good thing. And then she finds out that he has been cheating. That is indeed a murder of a goddess. In light of the scientific findings we have presented above, the best way to ensure that a man will not cheat is for him to have real orgasms. The woman can and should support him in this, but in a certain way that is not her job. There are ways that a man can work to achieve real orgasms that are not mere ejaculations, and we've discussed the difference between the two, and we are about to talk about one of those ways. Let us turn now to our next topic, which is sex and yoga. In an article published in the journal Sexual Medicine, a group of researchers sought to establish the effect yoga can have on female sexual functions. They recruited 40 women aged 22 to 55 years who were enrolled in a yoga camp and were given a standardized questionnaire named Female Sexual Function Index, FSFI, before and after the 12-week session of yoga. Yoga asanas, which are believed to have effects on abdominopelvic muscle tone, gonads, endocrines, digestion, joint movements, and mood, were chosen specifically for the present study. 3 repetitions of each asana were suggested. Differential relaxation was taught to the patients once they had finished their daily yoga protocol, with a breathing technique called Anulom Vilom, breathing via alternate nostrils, and Shavasana, from the Sanskrit Shava, meaning a dead body, lying dead. The main outcome measure was the FSFI, the Female Sexual Function Index. It was found that after the completion of yoga sessions, the sexual function scores were significantly improved, probability that this was a random result as opposed to true correlation being less than 0.001. The improvement occurred in all 6 domains of FSFI, i.e., desire, arousal, lubrication, orgasm, satisfaction, and pain. The improvement was more in older women, aged more than 45 years, compared to with younger women, aged less than 45 years. Now let us turn to the effect of yoga on male sexual functioning. According to another article also published in the journal Sexual Medicine, a study was conducted of 65 males aged 24 to 60 years who were enrolled in a yoga camp and administered a well-known questionnaire, that is to say, male sexual quotient, the MSQ, before and after a 12-week session of yoga. The main outcome measures were MSQ scores before and after yoga sessions. After each yoga session, the male participants were taught differential relaxation in a similar manner to the previously cited study on women yoga participants. It was found that after the completion of yoga sessions, the sexual function scores were significantly improved. Again, probability that this was a random result as opposed to true correlation being less than 0.001. The improvement occurred in scores of all the domains of sexual function as studied by the MSQ: desire, intercourse satisfaction, performance, confidence, partner synchronization, erection, ejaculatory control, and orgasm. The number of subjects who were highly satisfied with their sexual life increased from 4.6% before yoga to 30.7% after completion of the yoga sessions. The researchers concluded that yoga appears to be an effective method of improving all domains of sexual functions in men. I would conclude that for both women and men, the improvements noted in this study are very likely to improve if yoga is continued to be practiced, especially with specific techniques derived from Tantra. So it's appropriate at this point to move on from the discussion of yoga and sexuality and the positive impact that yoga has on sexual satisfaction, performance, orgasm, etc., both for women and for men, to the subject of the chakras. According to Swami Satyananda Saraswati, quote, "The subject matter of consciousness, its investigation and discovery, is known as Tantra. It is a vast science in which every method of expanding the conscious experience has been explored. It has always been with man, ever since he began to probe the mysteries of his own existence. Tantra is not an Indian philosophy. There was a time when Tantra was the spiritual practice of men and women of every continent. Evidence exists that prior to the Atlantean civilization, Tantra was practiced in order to gain a greater vision and experience of reality. Tantra is the ancient spiritual heritage of mankind. Through accidents of history, civilization lost touch with the Tantric tradition during the dark ages of the Kali Yuga. Now, the Western civilizations are emerging from several hundred years of darkness. The 3 body-mind sets exist and operate in different dimensions, each maintained by the type of prana, meaning vital energy, necessary for and appropriate to that particular dimension. This does not mean that they are separate entities, but rather that they are parts of an organic whole. Each body-mind has within itself energy centers for controlling the flow of prana, and also a system of energy channels. These channels are called nadis, and the centers controlling them are known as chakras. Then the prana flow throughout the sushumna, the most important nadi, can be increased and the passage purified. This facilitates the rising of kundalini, the psychic power said to lie dormant at the base of the spine. Kundalini awakening is indispensable for true chakra awakening. Note that in Kundalini and Tantra, we are always speaking of body-mind. Body-mind together. Going back to episode 1 of this series, we have always insisted that René Descartes' insistence that the body and mind are fundamentally different, with the mind being superior and the body secondary or even inferior, has been a great detriment to humanity, and particularly so to so-called Western civilizations. The idea of mind-body dualism, going back to Plato, permeates both Western philosophy and monotheistic misogynist religions. In our recent episode entitled The Murder of the Goddess, we illustrated how misogyny can be traced back to the origins of the ancient Egyptian pharaoh who single-handedly invented monotheism, the belief that there is only one masculine deity. He felt that he needed to discredit and in fact banish and prevent the worship of the female goddesses because he himself was incapable of performing sexually with a woman due to a genetic deformity, which led him to have a hatred of women. He even banished his own beautiful wife in favor of a male cousin. But returning to the chakras. Of the 7 chakras, the 2 most relevant to this series are 1, Anahata. Anahata is generally symbolized as a circular flower with bursts of 12 green petals known as the heart mind. Within the circular flower there lies a yantra of 2 intersecting triangles that form a perfect hexagram. This geometric symbol is an illustration of the union of the male and the female. Anahata is anatomically located in the chest region in and around the heart. Thus, Anahata is located within the site where our T cells are maturated. This is vital for our immunity and for fending off diseases, but can be adversely affected by stress. To break down Anahata's responsibilities systematically. Physically, it governs circulation. Emotionally, it governs unconditional love for the self and others. Mentally, it governs passion, and spiritually, it governs devotion. And 2, Muladhara. Muladhara, or more commonly known as the Root Chakra, is generally symbolized by a lotus flower with 4 petals that is bright red in color. Muladhara is anatomically associated as being located at the base of the spine or near the anus and the gonads. Because of this rooted location within the body, the Muladhara represents our foundation and our ability to remain grounded mentally. This is where we house our basic identity and values. This root chakra is normally related to survival, instinct, security, and the basic human potentiality. To break down Muladhara's responsibilities systematically, physically, it covers sexuality. Mentally, it governs stability. Emotionally, it governs sensuality. And spiritually, it governs a sense of security. In the following section, I discuss research conducted by Dr. Hiroshi Motoyama, who holds doctorates in psychology and philosophy. He founded the Institute for Religion and Psychology and is author of over 20 books. He and his group have designed several laboratory instruments specifically developed to study the chakras. The chakra instrument was designed to detect the energy generated in the body and then emitted from it in terms of various physical variables. Unlike the electroencephalograph and other instruments of electrophysiology, it is designed to detect minute energy changes, electric, magnetic, and optical, in the immediate environment of the subject. The AMI, apparatus for measuring the functional conditions of meridians and their corresponding internal organs, is an instrument designed to measure the initial skin current as well as the steady-state current in response to DC voltage externally applied at special acupuncture points located alongside the base of finger and toenails. A variety of studies have been performed at Dr. Motoyama's institute with the chakra instrument and the AMI instrument, which studies have led to some very provocative results. I would like to concentrate here on the results of certain studies conducted with subjects who had clearly displayed various forms of chakra activity and psi abilities. Psi abilities, one might expand that term to describe it as psychic abilities of various types. Psychic abilities. But let's go on. Basically, Dr. Motoyama and his group found that the type of psi ability evidence does seem to be connected to the specific chakras supposedly responsible for them, and that such subjects, in turn, do show characteristic patterns of abnormality in their meridian systems. Further, he found supportive evidence of the traditional notion that psi abilities can be classified into two types, the powers of reception and the powers of generation. The powers of reception appear to be linked to the lower chakras, and the powers of generation to the higher. This set of data implies quite profoundly that psi energy working in the Anahata chakra may be able to create energy in the physical dimension, light, electricity, etc. Again, referring to the distinction between the powers of reception, that is the ability to power to receive psychic inputs, information, vibrations, if you want to call it that, thought patterns, many other types of inputs from outside of the body, from other individuals, from other worlds, from other species, from other planets, the powers of reception, and the powers of generation. These two are distinct and interesting, with the powers of reception associated and linked with the lower chakras, and the powers of generation, the ability to create energy in the physical dimension, light, electricity, etc. Who knows what other powers and forces there are out there. We are still discovering them not exclusively through science and quantum physics, but through explorations of the spirit, the psyche, and the mind. Who knows what more may be lying out there? The recordings made on both the AMI machine and on the chakra instrument point to the possibility that the psi energy working in the chakras can either extinguish or create energy in the physical dimension. These two properties are of great significance, and if they can be further substantiated, would indicate the need of a basic revision of the law of conservation of energy as presently formulated in modern physics. I should note that in his book, Dr. Motoyama is primarily concerned with the use of the yoga asanas to sublimate sexual desires for higher purposes. Our attitude here on ecstatic sensuality is quite different. It is rather that the yoga asanas can, and if so desired by the individual, should be used to intensify love and pleasure. Our next area of focus today is on issues of self-love, self-esteem, and the influence those factors have on sexuality, on attraction, on pleasure, and on love. Research conducted by psychologists at Rutgers University in New Jersey, the University of California Medical School in San Francisco, and elsewhere has shown that poor body image and associated shame can make for a bad sex life. Objectification theory, Fredrickson and Roberts, 1997, proposed that body image concerns impair sexual function and satisfaction. The study we are about to discuss was designed to test whether body shame was related to sexual problems and pleasure among a group of 320 heterosexual men and women. Using structural equation modeling, the researchers tested whether adult men and women's body shame was linked to greater sexual problems, that is to say, lower sexual arousability and ability to reach orgasm, and less pleasure from physical intimacy. Although women were more significantly likely to report appearance concerns than men across sexual and non-sexual contexts, appearance concerns were positively related to both men and women's sexual problems. The relationship between body shame and sexual pleasure and problems was mediated by sexual self-consciousness during physical intimacy. Men and women's body shame was related to greater sexual self-consciousness, which in turn predicted lower sexual pleasure and sexual arousability. Results persisted, controlling for relationship status and age. That is to say, that these elements, these findings, were not related to either relationship status or age. Very interesting. Being in a relationship was associated with less sexual self-consciousness and less orgasm difficulty for men and women. Although some paths were significantly stronger for women than for men, results largely supported the proposition that body concerns negatively affect sexual pleasure and promote sexual problems for both men and women. Although body concerns may be more prevalent among women, recent studies suggest that men have begun to focus more on their appearance. Over the last few decades, men have come under increasing pressure to conform to lean, muscular ideals, as reported by Frith and Gleason in 2004. Action figures sold as toys to young boys have become slimmer and more muscular over the last 25 years, as have male centerfolds between the years 1973 to today. The naked male body is displayed more frequently in women's magazines, suggesting that men are increasingly becoming the object of the female gaze. Heterosexual men now increasingly feel pressure to be metrosexual, a term coined for heterosexual men who devote considerable attention to their physical appearance and clothing. According to a study published in the journal Perceptual and Motor Skills, these changes have led some theorists to argue that, similar to the unrealistically thin female body ideal, the media has created physical ideals for men that are impossible to achieve. See the research of Saluso-Deonier, Marquis, and Peterson. In fact, research published in the journal Men and Masculinity and in the Journal of Clinical Psychiatry suggests that heterosexual men are becoming increasingly dissatisfied with their physical appearance. We should factor in these empirical research results with what we learned from this podcast's recent episode on attractiveness and attraction, which I strongly urge anyone who is not to listen to that or view that on YouTube to go back and check it out. That episode presented research which clearly demonstrated that physical attraction is the most important element throughout the course of a proto-relationship or an actual relationship. Researchers were astounded to find that even in long-term relationships or marriages, physical attraction always remained the most important factor in evaluations of relationship satisfaction or quality. Both women and men feel considerable pressure to remain physically attractive to their relationship partners out of anxiety that if they do not, the relationship will falter, or perhaps even dwindle and come to an end. Research also shows that sexual satisfaction is largely determined by the attractiveness of one's partner. One does not derive maximal sexual satisfaction from an unattractive person, even if one loves that person in a more spiritual sense. We all want that sexiness, that beauty, that feeling of zazazoom, the feeling of being turned on, turned on, turned on. And the feeling of being turned on is a feeling of being turned on by the physical, by the physical. An unattractive person or a person with less present or apparent sexuality has a very difficult time radiating that attractiveness or that zazazoom. Very difficult. All of these factors can result in a deterioration of one's self-esteem and self-love. One might argue that if one loves oneself, one either is likely to take greater steps to improve one's appearance, and thus one's attractiveness, or that stronger self-love in and of itself increases one's attractiveness, both in general and to one's partner. Or for that matter, to others at large, including potential dating partners. This is obviously of extreme importance to everybody who is interested in having sensual, sexual relationship interactions with other people, irrespective of their particular gender choice. If one is content to be isolated and solipsistic, one has not so much a concern about this, but if one really wants to have a love and sensual relationship with someone, attractiveness is so important. Ridding oneself of shame is so important. But if one feels that one is not attractive, it is very difficult to rid oneself of shame. Patricia Highsmith was an American writer best known for her novels featuring the character Tom Ripley. A number of her books have been adapted into films, beginning with Alfred Hitchcock's famous Strangers in a Train, and moving on to The Cry of the Owl, made into a film by the great French director Claude Chabrol as Le Cri de Hibou. In my capacity as chief executive officer of an important motion picture production company, it was proposed to me that I produce a new English-language version based on this novel, but I declined, feeling that no one could possibly compete with Chabrol's singularly creepy masterpiece. Based, in fact, on a singularly creepy and weird novel by Patricia Highsmith. The best-known movie adaptation of one of her books was The Talented Mr. Ripley, featuring Gwyneth Paltrow, now if I understand, someone who has crawled down to the depths of television, Cate Blanchett, and Matt Damon. Phyllis Nagy described Patricia Highsmith as a, quote, lesbian who did not much enjoy being around other women, and it is in that context that I present the following quotations from her recently published diaries. From 7 August 1941. Sex, to me, should be a religion. I have no other. I feel no other urge. To devotion, to something, and we all need a devotion to something besides ourselves, besides even our noblest ambitions. I could be content without fulfillment. Perhaps I would be better in such an arrangement. From 13 May 1942. Yes, maybe sex is my main theme in literature, being the most profound influence on me, manifesting itself in repressions and negatives, but the most profound influence because even my failures are the results of repressions in body and mind, which are repressions of sex. This is a statement of great psychological insight, it strikes me. And it is sad that some people, in order to be creative, one way or the other, need to repress. And one can repress and have failure, and one can repress and have success. Fascinating. From September 24, 1943, Sexual love is the only emotion which has ever really touched me. Hatred, jealousy, even abstract devotion, never, except devotion to myself. But love touched me willy-nilly. So these are statements by Patricia Highsmith, which lead me to the following question. Is this a solipsistic view of love or a narcissistic view? In one sentence, she writes that sexual love is the only emotion which has ever really touched me, and 2 sentences later she writes, but love touched me willy-nilly. So, which is it, Patricia? I am not, I repeat, not a person who says that divine love or true love is or must or should be or ought to be asensual and asexual. That is to say, free of sensuality and free of sex. Far from it. This is in fact the opposite of my opinion. Of course there is love of nature, of friends, of children, of one's own creativity and of that of others, and of aesthetic experiences, which does not involve sex, although love of creativity and the arts is and should be a sensual love. One loves beautiful music sensually. One loves beautiful paintings sensually, beautiful sculptures, beautiful creations of literature and film. One loves these sensually. If one abstracts sensuality from these, the experience is so much less. However, I am saying that all sex, other than that based on commerce, which I do not eschew, should be based on love of one flavor or another. I repeat, I am saying that all sex, other than that based on commerce, and I don't put it down, I believe that so-called prostitution is a noble profession and is a means of sexual encounters which can be profitable and rewarding for many individuals on both sides of the equation. Returning, I am saying that all sex, other than that based on commerce, should be based on love of one flavor or another. Sex should never be mechanical or strictly about one's own solipsistic, narcissistic fulfillment. It should always be an act of shared pleasure, enjoyment, and above all, respect, mutual respect, happiness, shared happiness. The motto of this podcast is and will always be, love is a desire for another's happiness so strong that it fills one with incalculable joy. Here's my recommendation of a love and relationship coach and a psychotherapist. Her name is Anita DiFrancesco. Her website is www.tantrawisdom.com. She's also on her Tantra Wisdom Facebook business page and her Love and Relationship Coach Facebook page. She is not only a love and relationship counselor and psychotherapist, she is a 2-time National Award-winning journalist and the author of 2 excellent books, Live Free, Recreate and Liberate Your Life, which deals with matters such as the ones we discuss here in this podcast, mindfulness, sexuality, relationships, and so forth, and the Donna Gentili story, a spellbinding true crime thriller about the brutal murder of her first cousin and of her attempts to identify the killer. Both of these books, Live Free, Recreate and Liberate Your Life, and the Donna Gentili story, are available on Amazon, or check her website.